And as you can see on the front of your bulletins today, now tell me, have you ever seen a bulletin cover that looked like this before? Okay. All right, well, I found this picture, and what I have there is a picture that I think is going to be a good visual for the message today. And it is what I believe to be a blood vessel with some very nice looking blood cells running through it, doing their thing. And then up there in the corner, kind of in the background, is this what I think is a very menacing looking thing, isn't it? And it looks sort of like the end of a spiked ball and chain or something, or a mace from medieval times. This ugly black monstrosity with all these dangerous looking spikes jabbing out all over it. And I picked this image because I love the contrast in it. There's this nice serene image of these blood cells doing their thing. They're probably carrying oxygen to all the various parts of our body. And it all looks fine and good. And then you've got this thing, this germ of some sort, this disease-carrying agent of destruction. A medieval weapon of some sort. Probably a scientific mind or a doctor could tell me exactly what's going on in this picture, but I think I've got it figured out to what it means to me. And as I looked at this image that I found, I thought, you know, can these blood cells continue on in their duties as they should, or is this thing going to cause a problem in there? This thing that's hanging out there in the background, this awful, menacing looking thing, this spiky, dangerous looking thing, is it going to really mess up this circulatory system and prevent these things, these blood cells, from doing their job? Is this thing going to start replicating and spreading throughout the bloodstream and cause havoc all over the place? Is this ugly, nasty little thing there in the background going to take over and kill these poor little guys that are just trying to do what God created them to do? Does it look like that to you? I mean, if you look at it that way, through the eyes of Scripture, I think that's kind of what's going on here. And we are going to look at this, we'll refer to this visual from time to time, so make sure you have your bulletins handy. And we're also going to look at the Old Testament passage today from Joshua 11:16 through 20. Now Joshua was the guy who took over the leadership of the tribe of Israel after Moses was done leading them. Moses led them out of Egypt, and he took them into the desert, and they were there a long time, and then they arrived at the Promised Land. And this land of Canaan was a wonderful land for them. It was flowing with milk and honey, the Scriptures say. And God's people who had lived under slavery for so long, and under oppression for so long, under Egypt's Pharaoh, finally now had their own land. God was going to give them their own place. And they could be free there. And this was a place where they could raise their families, they could grow their crops, they could tend to their animals, they could build their own homes and own their own land. And it was a long time coming. But there was a little bit of an issue. God said, this land is yours. You can take this land now. But first, they had to defeat all these many kings and their armies that had settled in there. And if you back up in the passage a little bit, beyond what I have set the parameters for today, you'll see the names of these kings and the groups of people, the armies and the peoples that they were kings over. Jabin, king of Hazor; Jobab, king of Madon; the king of Shimron and Akshaph; kings in the north, kings in the south, kings in the west and the east. This land was crawling with people, with mighty armies, with kings and their people. And these people that were there now were not going to take very kindly to Israel moving in there. No matter what they said. They would thumb their noses at the prospect of being told that Israel's God said that they are to move there and to live there. The armies of these kings looked mighty and daunting. The sheer numbers of them would send anybody shivering in their boots. It was staggering to behold the mighty armies that were living in this land, that were living in opposition. But God said to Joshua in verse 6, he reassured him, he says, "Do not be afraid of them, because this time tomorrow I will hand them over to Israel slain." And sure enough, Joshua did what was commanded of him. He swept into the land, and Israel overtook the kings and their armies, the settlements. They put the kings to the swords, they hamstrung the horses, they burned the chariots, just as God had directed them to do. And verse 11 in that earlier passage says this, "Everyone in it they put to the sword, they totally destroyed them, not sparing anything that breathed." It was undoubtedly a bloody mess to behold, I'm sure of it. But the people of God took the land. And so we begin in verse 16 from our passage today with a description of this miraculous victory. A listing is given of all that Israelites had taken that day, the entire land. You can read that. And Alex, bless your heart for reading through those tough names. I know that was tough. But it was a lot of people, it was a lot of places, a lot of kings that they took the territory from that day. It was a military feat unequaled, Joshua and Israel's greatest conquest for sure. And it states there in verse 17 from the passage today, he captured all of their kings and he struck them down, putting them to death. And then it ends with this verse, verse 20. "For it was the Lord himself who hardened their hearts to wage war against Israel so that he might destroy them totally, exterminating them without mercy, as the Lord commanded Moses." Ouch. Is that hard for anyone else to read? I mean, let's be honest. Let's get real for a minute here. Does that language bother anybody else? Because we all know that God is the hero of our Bibles, right? But let's just be honest. Who is sounding a little bit like the bad guy in this passage? Look at the wordings again. Exterminating them. It sounds like Israel was taking out, like they had a termite problem or something that they had to get rid of. They called these pest control to wipe everything living out of that land. And destroy them totally. Soldiers, people, families, horses, everything that breathed, it says. And can we get real and admit that maybe we don't quite understand how our loving and holy God could allow not only this to take place, but to have an active part in it, to actually decree this and see that it happens. Well, before we label our God the bad guy here, let's look at the situation in the bigger context. And I begin with a passage from a few books prior to this one, and it's the book of Exodus. And this is where God hears the cries of the people enslaved in Egypt, and he delivers them to freedom. And in chapter 19, God has a conversation with Moses, his leader of his people. And he says to him in verse 5, "Now if you obey me fully and you keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession." And here's the biggie. "Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." So if you've ever wondered what God had in mind for Israel, that's it right there. And if you've ever wondered what everybody else means to God, that's there too. There's a news flash if you haven't figured it out yet. This whole world is God's. It's all his. All of us in this room, every living, breathing thing, everything in creation that you can view with your eyes is his. Every last man, woman, and child is his. And at one time, we all knew that. Everybody knew that. From the moment that that first man and woman was created and planted in that Garden of Eden, people knew that. They knew their God. They knew who created them. They knew who loved them. But then, after the fall, some chose to follow their God and acknowledge him, and others chose not to.